Selena Reed looked at the mechanic standing in front of her and set $100 bill on the metal table between them. "Just $100, she said. "Take it or leave it." Jason Cole did not argue. He picked up the bill, folded it once, and walked back toward the jet that was waiting to take off. A few minutes later, the engine roared to life. Then the entire control panel turned red. Warning after warning sounded through the cockpit speakers. Selena's senior technical team could not find the cause, no matter how many diagnostic screens they cycled through. Jason walked over, listened to the engine for only a few seconds, and said that if she took off now, she would not be coming back. Selena went still. The man she had just dismissed with pocket change was the only person in that hangar who understood what was happening to her airplane. The morning had begun like any other at Reed Aviation's private hangar on the northern edge of the airfield, with the low hum of ground equipment and the smell of jet fuel drifting through the open bay doors. A gleaming business jet sat under work lights, its access panels open, ground crew moving around it with the practiced calm of people who did this every day. Selena needed to be in the air within the hour. The meeting waiting for her in Denver could decide whether her company kept a contract that represented nearly a third of its annual revenue. And every minute the jet sat grounded was a minute closer to losing it. She stood near the nose of the aircraft in a charcoal coat, phone in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, watching her operations director argue with a technician she did not recognize. The technical crew had flagged something unusual in the auxiliary control system less than 2 hours before departure. A small deviation that should have been routine to clear but was not resolving the way it should have. Marcus Vale, the operations director, had called in outside help without asking Selena first. And the man who arrived was quiet, dressed in a plain gray jacket, carrying a single toolbox that looked older than the aircraft he was about to inspect. Jason worked alone. He did not introduce himself to anyone beyond a short nod, did not explain his process, and did not ask anyone to move out of his way twice. He crouched beside the open panel, ran his fingers along a wiring harness, and paused in a way that made the younger technicians stop talking. One of them, a woman barely out of her apprenticeship, finally asked if he was sure about what he was doing, since the readouts on the diagnostic tablet still showed green across the board. Jason answered without looking up that he was sure. There was nothing performative in the way he said it. No attempt to sound impressive, just the flat certainty of a man who had learned a long time ago that machines told the truth in ways screens sometimes did not. He worked for another 20 minutes, tracing a fault that the tablet had never flagged, before he finally straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and told Marcus the aircraft was clear to fly. Selena appeared at the base of the air stairs the moment the last panel clicked shut, already moving with the brisk energy of someone whose schedule had just been handed back to her. She did not ask what Jason had found or how close the aircraft had come to a problem. She asked only how much he charged, the question thrown out sideways, already half turned toward the stairs before he answered. Jason gave her a number that was fair for an emergency call on short notice, the kind of figure any charter operation would have paid without blinking. Selena's expression shifted into something colder, something used to negotiating men down without effort. And she reached into her coat, pulled out a single $100 bill, and pressed it flat onto the toolbox beside him. "Just $100, she said again. "Take it or leave it." The hangar went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them senses that something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Marcus glanced away. The young technician stared at her tablet like it had suddenly become fascinating. Jason looked down at the bill, and then up at Selena. And there was no anger in his face, no wounded pride demanding to be soothed. He did not list his qualifications. He did not remind her what he had just found. He simply reached out, picked up the bill, folded it once, and slid it into his jacket pocket. "Fine," he said. And that single word landed heavier than any argument could have, because it was clear he meant it. And clear it cost her something she had not expected to pay. Selena felt, for half a second, the strange discomfort of having won an exchange that did not feel like winning. She turned to leave, already dismissing the encounter from her mind, already thinking about the runway and the meeting in Denver. But Jason did not walk away yet. He turned back toward the jet one more time, and something in the angle, the look of a man who had heard a single wrong note in a room full of music that otherwise sounded perfectly in tune. He crouched again near the rear of the fuselage, close to where the auxiliary systems fed into the main engine housing, and listened. Nobody else in the hangar seemed to notice anything. The ground crew continuing their pre-flight checks, Marcus already reviewing paperwork on a clipboard, Selena halfway up the air stairs with her assistant. Jason straightened slowly, walked to where Marcus stood, and asked who had signed off on the aircraft being flight-ready. Marcus answered without looking up from his clipboard, saying that he had. Jason studied him for a long moment, long enough that Marcus finally raised his eyes. And then Jason said, quietly, that he should check it again. Marcus's jaw tightened. He told Jason that the contract work was finished and paid for, that his opinion on the broader airworthiness of the aircraft had not been requested, and that the flight was going ahead on schedule. Jason did not push further. He simply repeated that someone should look again before that jet left the ground, gathered his tools, and stepped back toward the hangar wall to watch. Selena, catching only the tail end of the exchange from the top of the stairs, felt a flash of irritation rather than concern. Assuming the mechanic she had just underpaid was manufacturing drama to sting her on his way out, one last attempt to matter, after being handed $100 and dismissed like anyone else on her payroll. Selena ordered the ground crew to finish final preparations, and Marcus assured her, twice, that the aircraft was in perfect condition, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who trusted his instruments more than his instincts. Jason remained a few yards from the jet, arms folded, watching the propeller housing with the stillness of someone who had learned patience the hard way. He listened to the compressor cycle through its startup sequence, watched the data stream across a secondary screen that nobody else was reading, and said nothing unless someone asked him directly. A young technician, the same one who had questioned him earlier, drifted over and asked if he still saw something wrong. He told her there was something that was not in the report. He opened the maintenance log himself, flipping through pages of service history with the quiet efficiency of a man who had read 1,000 logs before this one. A single detail caught his attention, a discrepancy between the recorded flight hours and the actual operational history of the aircraft, small enough that most eyes would have skated past it without a second look. Jason suspected a component had been replaced at some point without the paperwork being updated to reflect it accurately, which meant the system might be operating on assumptions that no longer matched reality. It was the kind of gap that rarely caused problems on its own, but combined with anything else out of place, it could turn into something far more dangerous in the air than on the ground. Marcus noticed him lingering over the logbook and crossed the hangar floor with visible irritation, telling Jason flatly that he was only a contract technician and had no business second-guessing the operations team on matters outside his scope. Jason closed the log without raising his voice and said that he knew exactly what his scope was. Marcus told him, then, not to overstep it. Jason met his eyes and said he was not overstepping anything, that he was simply trying to stop a mistake before it became one that could not be undone. It was a sentence that should have landed as reasonable in any hangar in the country, but here, in this one, it only made Marcus more defensive, more certain that his authority was being quietly challenged in front of the crew. Selena, listening from a few steps away, chose Marcus's side without hesitation, telling both men that what she needed right now was an airplane in the sky, not a lecture about paperwork. Jason went silent at that, the kind of silence that carried more weight than any protest could have. He walked back to his toolbox, signed off on the specific repair he had been contracted to complete, and left the broader airworthiness certification blank, a small but deliberate act that nobody in the hangar seemed to register as significant in the moment. It would matter enormously later. He had done his job. He had not certified the whole aircraft, because he was not willing to put his name to something he was not certain of. And that distinction, quiet as it was, said more about who he was than any speech could have. By then it was becoming clear to anyone paying close attention that Jason operated by a short list of unbending rules. He did not claim credit for work that was not fully his. He did not let money, or the lack of it, dictate how carefully he did a job. He refused to sign his name to anything he could not fully stand behind, regardless of the pressure applied to make him. And he did not let a personal insult, however sharp, tempt him into walking away from a danger he could see and others could not. Those four things, taken together, were the entire architecture of the man. And none of them had been visible to Selena Reed when she pressed a single bill into his hand and called it fair. Selena climbed the air stairs a second time, this time for good, disappearing into the cabin with her assistant close behind her. The engines began their startup sequence. A low whine building steadily into a deeper, fuller roar as fuel and air met in the right proportions inside each turbine. Jason stood at the edge of the tarmac, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the fuselage, and checked his watch out of habit rather than need. A faint metallic sound rose from somewhere deep inside the airframe, barely audible over the growing engine noise. The kind of sound that most people would never register as anything but background. Jason's head turned instantly toward it. Every trace of stillness gone from his posture in the space of a single breath. He started moving before he had fully processed what he had heard, calling out for someone to cut the engines, his voice carrying across the tarmac with an urgency that had not been there a moment before. Nobody responded. The ground crew was focused on clearance checks. Marcus was inside, reviewing departure paperwork with his back to the window. The engines continued their climb toward full power, indifferent to the one man standing on the tarmac who understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that something inside that airframe was already beginning to fail. The engines climbed through their startup range, and for a moment everything sounded exactly as it should, the twin turbines settling into a steady, even howl that any passenger would have found reassuring. Selena sat in the cabin scrolling through notes for her Denver meeting, half listening to the familiar rhythm of departure. Marcus stood near the cockpit doorway, monitoring a tablet linked to the aircraft's diagnostic feed, watching numbers scroll past that told him, according to every system he trusted, that nothing was wrong. Outside, Jason ran along the edge of the tarmac toward the ground crew chief, shouting over the noise that the engines needed to be cut immediately, that something in the sound had changed in a way the instruments were not yet showing. Nobody moved right away, and in the space of those few seconds, the aircraft's automated systems pushed past the anomaly and settled, as engines sometimes do, into what looked like a clean startup. Jason reached the base of the stairs breathing hard. And it was there that he heard it again, sharper this time, a faint but unmistakable irregularity buried inside the deeper roar of the turbines. He climbed partway up the stairs and banged on the fuselage near the cockpit window, and Marcus, startled, finally looked up from his tablet and saw the mechanic he had dismissed less than an hour earlier standing outside the aircraft, insisting something was wrong that no screen in front of him was reporting. Marcus checked the readouts again, running a full sweep of the electronic monitoring suite, and told Jason through the small gap of the open door that everything was reading within normal parameters, that it was likely nothing more than a sensor glitch working itself out during warm-up. Jason answered simply that it was not a sensor. Marcus asked, with an edge of frustration creeping into his voice, what exactly Jason thought he was looking at, since there was no visual or digital indication of any fault. Jason told him he was not looking at anything. He was listening to it, and what he heard did not match what a healthy engine should sound like at this stage of ignition. It was the kind of statement that could have sounded absurd coming from anyone else. A man claiming to detect a mechanical failure by ear that an entire suite of sensors had missed, but there was nothing theatrical in how Jason said it, only the flat conviction of someone who had spent decades learning the difference between a machine breathing normally and one straining under a hidden flaw. A faint tremor passed through the airframe then, subtle enough that most passengers would have mistaken it for ordinary vibration, but Selena felt it in her seat and looked up sharply from her notes, asking Marcus through the open cockpit door what was happening. Marcus, still trying to project calm, told her the system was running its self-check sequence. Jason climbed the last few steps into the cabin doorway and said, without hesitation, that it was not a self-check. He pointed toward the small secondary display near the flight engineer's station, the one nobody on the flight crew had bothered to monitor closely because the primary system showed no faults. On it, A string of minor error codes was cycling in and out too quickly for the main system to log them as a pattern, each one appearing for less than a second before resetting, invisible to anyone who was not specifically watching that particular screen. Marcus argued that the primary system showed nothing of the kind, that Jason was reading noise into data that meant nothing. Jason answered that the primary system was reading corrupted input, which was exactly the problem, because if the source feeding the diagnostics was compromised, then everything downstream of it, including the reassuring green lights Marcus kept pointing to, was built on a foundation that could not be trusted. Selena demanded, in a voice that had lost all patience, that someone explain to her clearly and immediately what was actually happening with her aircraft. Nobody answered right away. Marcus looked at his tablet. The ground crew chief looked at Marcus. Jason looked at Selena. And in that look, for the first time since she had met him that morning, she saw something that was not defiance and was not resentment, only urgency. Jason told her, plainly, that the engines needed to be shut down immediately, that whatever was happening inside that turbine housing was still developing, and would only get harder to see and harder to fix the longer it ran at full power. Selena, for the first time all morning, actually looked at him the way she would look at someone whose judgment mattered, rather than someone whose time she was simply purchasing at the lowest possible price. She held his gaze for a long moment, the cabin humming around them, the weight of a decision that could cost her a critical meeting or, if she was wrong to ignore him, cost far more than that. Jason leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping just enough that only she and Marcus could hear it clearly over the engine noise, and said that if she let this aircraft run at full power for even a few more minutes, there would not be enough time left to fix whatever was building inside it before it became something they could no longer control from the ground. It was not a threat. It was not an exaggeration meant to win an argument. It was simply the truth, as he understood it, delivered without flourish. And it hit Selena harder than any raised voice could have. Because she realized, in that instant, that the man standing in her cabin doorway was not trying to prove a point about being underpaid. He was trying to keep her alive. The engines were shut down within minutes, and the aircraft was towed back to the maintenance bay under a silence far heavier than the one that had followed Selena's $100 bill earlier that morning. Marcus and Victor Hale, the company's longtime head of technical operations, wheeled out the advanced diagnostic rig that Reed Aviation had spent a small fortune installing the previous year, confident that whatever Jason believed he had heard would show up clearly once real equipment was brought to bear on the problem. The scan ran its full cycle, lights blinking green across every subsystem, and Victor read the summary aloud, with the satisfaction of a man whose expensive machine had just vindicated him. "No critical fault detected," he said, glancing at Jason with something close to pity, the kind of look reserved for someone who had let instinct get ahead of evidence. Selena's patience, worn thin by the delay and the mounting cost of every idle minute, finally broke. And she turned to Jason, with her arms crossed, telling him flatly that he had said there was a problem, and her own people were telling her there was not. Jason did not flinch and did not try to defend himself with words. Instead, he asked for 4 things. The raw data logs, rather than the summarized report, a comparison against the aircraft's actual recorded flight hours, a manual check of the relevant sensors rather than a software-based reading of them, and a full look at the wiring runs feeding into the affected system, along with the component replacement history for that section of the airframe. Victor let out a short laugh, telling Jason that his team had performed exactly this kind of inspection thousands of times over a long career and did not need a contractor walking them through the basics. Jason answered simply that he believed him. Victor, thrown slightly off balance by the lack of confrontation in the response, asked why. Then, Jason still refused to accept the results in front of him. Jason's answer was quiet, but unmistakably firm. Machines did not lie, but the people entering data into them sometimes did, whether through carelessness, shortcuts, or simple human error. And a diagnostic system was only as honest as the information it had been fed. The air in the maintenance bay shifted at that. The easy confidence in the room, replaced by something more brittle, because everyone present understood exactly what Jason was implying. without him having to spell it out further. He pulled the raw logs himself, scrolling through pages of numerical data, with the same unhurried focus he had shown that morning, cross-referencing timestamps against the aircraft's actual flight history, logged separately in a maintenance binder that had clearly not been consulted in months. Somewhere in the middle of that comparison, he found a discrepancy small enough to be easy to miss and significant enough to change everything. A single sensor reading that had been flagged once, months earlier, as slightly outside normal range, and then quietly cleared without any documented follow-up inspection. It was not, on its own, a smoking gun. It was a thread, and Jason understood, better than anyone else in that hangar, that a thread like this was exactly how larger failures usually began. Not with a single catastrophic break, but with a chain of small, unremarkable oversights that nobody had bothered to close. He explained, carefully and without drama, that if that sensor's signal had drifted further out of tolerance since it was last checked, it could be feeding a slightly delayed or slightly inaccurate reading into the control system responsible for regulating fuel and airflow. And under sustained high power, that kind of delay could translate into a real and dangerous mismatch between what the engine needed and what it was actually receiving. Selena watched him work, something in her posture softening almost imperceptibly, and for the first time that day she did not refer to him as a technician when she spoke. She simply asked him how long he needed. Jason told her 20 minutes to prove it one way or the other. She nodded once and told the rest of the room to give him the time. A small sentence that nonetheless represented an enormous shift, since it meant she was choosing to trust the instincts of a man she had paid $100 over the certainty of a diagnostic system that had cost the company a great deal more. Jason worked quickly, but without rushing, removing a small housing near the suspect sensor with careful, practiced hands, exposing a component no larger than a deck of cards nestled among a tangle of wiring. He turned it over once in the light, and there, along one edge, was a faint discoloration, the unmistakable signature of heat stress, a scorch mark so slight that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. He held it up for Victor and Marcus to see, his voice low but absolutely certain as he said only 2 words, "Here it is." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in that hangar. Because for the first time, nobody in the room had anything left to argue. Jason explained the failure in plain terms, telling the room that the damaged component had likely been feeding intermittently corrupted data to the flight control system for some time, worsening under stress and heat, and that it was only a matter of when, not if, it would have caused a serious malfunction once the aircraft reached higher altitude and sustained power. Marcus, staring at the small scorched part in Jason's hand, still tried to argue that the damage looked minor, that it could have been an isolated defect rather than evidence of a larger issue. Victor, more experienced and less willing to keep defending a position that was visibly collapsing, admitted quietly that the discoloration pattern was consistent with prolonged thermal stress rather than a one-time event, which meant it had likely been developing for weeks. Selena stood at the center of the disagreement, forced into a decision that no diagnostic screen could make for her, whether to trust the company's own technical department, backed by years of tenure and expensive equipment, or a contractor she had underpaid and dismissed only hours earlier. Outside the hangar, her phone buzzed steadily with messages from Denver, each one a small reminder of exactly how much the delay was costing her, both in dollars and in the confidence of people who were waiting for her to walk through their door on time. She told Jason, her voice tight, that she could not simply cancel the flight. Jason answered that he was not asking her to cancel it. She asked then what exactly he wanted from her. Jason said he wanted her to delay departure until he could be certain the aircraft was actually safe, not until a screen told her it was, but until the physical evidence backed that claim up completely. Selena's frustration flared, and she told him he had no idea how much money she was losing with every minute the jet sat grounded on the tarmac, instead of climbing toward Denver. Jason said that he did know, or at least understood the shape of it, and when she demanded, sharply, whether that meant anything to him, he looked at her steadily and said that a life was still worth more than that. The sentence landed harder than anything else said in that hangar all morning, not because it was clever or rehearsed, but because it was obviously, simply true, and everyone standing there knew it, even if some of them had been trained by years of corporate pressure to act as though it were not. Jason did not elaborate on why those words carried the particular weight they did in his voice, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed a flicker of something older and heavier behind his eyes. The shadow of an incident from years earlier, when a small, easily dismissed mechanical flaw had gone unchallenged by someone who knew better and stayed silent anyway. He did not tell that story now. He did not need to. He only needed Selena to understand that he was not willing to let it happen twice. Not on his watch, not with his name anywhere near the outcome. Something in Selena shifted visibly then, the hard set of her shoulders easing just slightly, the reflexive defensiveness in her voice giving way to something closer to genuine consideration. She turned to the room and said, in a tone that left no space for negotiation, that nobody was to restart that aircraft until Jason confirmed it was ready, and that his confirmation, not Marcus's schedule, and not the diagnostic summary, was now the standard the flight would be measured against. Marcus looked stunned, his mouth opening as though to object before he thought better of it, the reality of the shift in authority settling over him with visible discomfort. Jason did not smile or take any satisfaction from the moment. He simply turned back toward the open panel and returned to work, because for him this had never been about winning an argument, only about finishing the job correctly. The hangar had barely settled into its new rhythm around Jason's authority when one of the junior technicians hurried over from a workstation near the rear of the bay, calling out to Selena that they had just found something else. Selena turned sharply, asking what kind of something. The technician, still catching her breath, explained that if Jason was right about the damaged component, the pattern of wear on it suggested the underlying problem had existed long before the aircraft was ever brought into this particular hangar for its most recent service, which meant the failure had traveled with the airplane through at least one previous maintenance cycle without ever being caught or corrected. Selena ordered a full review of the aircraft's maintenance history going back 2 full years, and within an hour a picture began to emerge that unsettled her far more than a single faulty sensor ever could have. Several entries in the records did not line up cleanly with each other. Dates that seemed to have been adjusted, a component listed as replaced that, according to Jason's inspection, still bore the wear pattern of a part several years older than its paperwork claimed. Jason did not accuse anyone by name. He laid out only what he could verify with his own hands and his own eyes, telling Selena plainly that he could only speak to what he had personally seen, and what he had seen did not match what had been documented. Selena asked him, almost testing him, whether he did not want to know who was responsible for the discrepancy. Jason admitted that he did want to know, because sloppy or falsified maintenance records put every future flight crew and passenger at risk, not just the people standing in this hangar today. She pressed further, asking why, if he wanted to know, he was not pushing harder to expose whoever had cut corners. Jason's answer was simple and, to Selena, unexpectedly disarming, because right now the priority had to be fixing the aircraft in front of them, and chasing blame before the immediate danger was resolved would only slow down the one thing that actually mattered in this moment. It was a small answer, but it told Selena something enormous about the kind of man standing in her hangar. Someone who was clearly capable of building a case against Marcus, against Victor, against the entire technical department if he chose to, and yet had no visible interest in using what he knew as leverage for himself. He was not angling for a bigger contract. He was not hinting that his silence had a price. He simply wanted the airplane fixed, and the people flying in it safe, and everything else, including his own vindication, could apparently wait. Selena found herself studying him in a way she rarely studied anyone, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man in front of her with the kind of leverage most people in her world would have exploited without a second thought. She reached into her coat and pulled out the same $100 bill Jason had accepted that morning, the one she had, without quite admitting it to herself, been carrying around ever since as a small, uncomfortable reminder of how the day had begun. She set it down on the workbench in front of him and told him, quietly enough that only he could hear, that she had paid him far too little. Jason glanced at the bill and agreed simply that she had. Selena waited, expecting him to name a new figure, the way almost everyone in her professional life would have done the instant an opening like that presented itself. Instead, Jason told her to leave it where it was. She asked why. He told her that he had already accepted it once, and once was enough, that the point had never really been about the number printed on the bill in the first place. Selena looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, as she began to understand, for the first time, that Jason was not a man short on money, in the way she had assumed that morning when she offered him a fraction of what his work was worth. What he valued, she was beginning to realize, was something that did not have a price tag attached to it at all: fairness, and the simple, uncomplicated integrity of a person keeping their word once it had been given. She asked him, somewhat impulsively, whether he was always like this, unmoved by what anyone else thought of him. Jason considered the question seriously before answering, telling her that he did care what people thought. He simply refused to let that concern be the thing that decided what he did. Selena did not have a response ready for that, and for a few seconds the two of them simply stood there in the noise of the hangar, neither one quite willing to be the first to look away. Jason finished the repair not long after, wiping the last of the grease from his hands, and telling her the aircraft could be restarted now. Before signaling anyone to move, though, he turned back to Selena one more time, his voice carrying none of the earlier tension, only a quiet, almost gentle kind of respect that had not been there between them a few hours before. He asked her whether, this time, she wanted to check it herself. Selena climbed the air stairs beside Jason this time instead of ahead of him, an arrangement that would have seemed unthinkable to her only a few hours earlier, and stood near the cockpit as the engines were brought up for a second startup sequence. The initial whine sounded no different from before, still carrying the same tension it always did in the seconds before an engine settled into steady operation, and everyone in the cabin seemed to hold their breath together as the turbines climbed toward full power. Selena watched Jason rather than the instrument panel, searching his face for any sign of alarm the way she might once have searched a spreadsheet for a warning figure. A single warning flickered briefly on the secondary display, the same kind of fleeting error that had appeared before. And for a moment the tension in the cabin spiked sharply, Marcus's hand tightening around the edge of his tablet, Victor leaning forward instinctively, as though proximity alone could help him read the screen faster. Jason did not move. He watched the display without reacting, his expression calm in a way that seemed to steady the entire cabin around him, and a few seconds later, the warning cleared and did not return. The engine settled into a smooth, even roar. No tremor beneath it. No irregular pulse hidden in its rhythm. Just the clean, steady sound of a machine finally operating exactly the way it was designed to. Victor ran a full diagnostic sweep a second time, and this time the data came back clean in a way that actually meant something, because it had been earned rather than assumed. Marcus said nothing at all, staring at the readouts with an expression that suggested he was recalculating a great many assumptions all at once. Selena stepped down from the cabin once the engines were powered back down for final confirmation, and walked directly to where Jason stood near the base of the stairs, telling him, without any of the earlier coldness in her voice, that he had just saved her flight. Jason answered simply that he had fixed one problem. She corrected him, saying it was a problem her own team, with all their expensive equipment and years of experience, had completely missed. Jason told her that meant they would catch it next time, a small, almost generous reframing of the morning's failures that surprised her more than any compliment could have. Selena allowed herself a faint smile then, the first genuine one Jason had seen from her since he arrived that morning, and something about it made the tension that had defined their first meeting feel, for a moment, like it belonged to an entirely different day. It was the first time anyone in that hangar had seen her expression soften even slightly, and the shift did not go unnoticed by the crew watching from a respectful distance. But the morning was not finished, delivering complications. As Jason reviewed the final data from the repaired system, cross-referencing it once more against the maintenance history that had already raised so many questions, he noticed that the failure did not look like an isolated accident, so much as the predictable outcome of a pattern. It did not need to be framed as some sprawling corporate conspiracy to be serious. It looked, more plainly, like the kind of damage that accumulated when maintenance schedules were quietly compressed to save time. when replacement parts were sourced from cheaper suppliers without adequate testing, or when inspection windows were shortened under pressure to keep aircraft available and revenue flowing. Any one of those explanations, on its own, was a serious problem for a company that flew executives and clients on a near-daily basis. Selena absorbed this information slowly, watching a version of her own company come into focus that she had never had reason to examine this closely before, one where cost pressure from higher up the chain might have quietly reshaped how her technical department operated without her ever explicitly authorizing it. She asked Jason whether he believed the discrepancies were the result of deliberate wrongdoing or simple neglect allowed to compound over time, and he told her honestly that he could not say for certain that either explanation was possible, and that the honest answer would only come from a careful, methodical review, rather than a rushed guess made under pressure in a hangar. At the end of a long day, that answer, cautious and unwilling to overstate what the evidence actually supported, told Selena something else about the man standing in front of her. He was not interested in drama for its own sake, not interested in painting a villain where the facts did not yet justify one. Only in finding the truth and acting on it responsibly once it was found. She turned to Jason and told him she wanted him to inspect every aircraft the company owned, not just the one that had nearly failed that morning. Jason reminded her, almost gently, that he was only a contract technician, brought in for a single emergency call, and already compensated, however inadequately, for that specific job. Selena looked at him and said that was no longer true. Not anymore. Selena's offer was not a gesture made lightly, and she made that clear the moment she said it, telling Jason she wanted him on retainer as a special technical advisor with authority over the airworthiness of every aircraft in her fleet, reporting to her directly rather than through Marcus or Victor. Jason did not accept immediately. He asked her why, a question that seemed to catch her slightly off guard, as though the answer should have been obvious. She told him it was because he was good at what he did, and Jason answered that this was not the real reason she was asking. Selena went quiet for a moment before admitting, more honestly than she was used to speaking to anyone in a professional context, that she also wanted to know what else he might find, if given the freedom to look. She allowed herself a faint smile as she said it, something almost playful, breaking through the composed exterior she usually presented to the people who worked for her. And Jason found himself, for the first time that day, matching it with something close to his own. Over the following days, the two of them began working alongside each other more closely than either had anticipated when the morning started, moving between hangars and maintenance logs and technical briefings, and Selena found herself noticing details about Jason that had nothing to do with engines or wiring diagrams at all. He never talked about his own accomplishments unless directly asked, and even then, only in the fewest words necessary. He arrived earlier than anyone else on the team, every single day, without fail. He checked every detail himself, rather than relying on someone else's word, not out of distrust exactly, but out of a deeply ingrained habit of verifying things before trusting them completely. His demeanor did not change depending on who he was speaking to, whether it was a junior technician sweeping the hangar floor or the CEO signing his paycheck. A consistency that Selena, surrounded her whole career by people whose behavior shifted depending on how much power stood in front of them, found unexpectedly rare and unexpectedly moving. And above everything else, he placed safety ahead of convenience, ahead of schedule, ahead of profit. Every single time, without exception, in a way that made her reconsider how many of her own decisions over the years had quietly reversed that order without her ever noticing. Jason, for his part, began to see something in Selena that the morning's confrontation had not prepared him for either. Beneath the sharp edges and the clipped, transactional way she had first spoken to him, there was a woman carrying an enormous amount of pressure that rarely showed itself in public. Pressure from a board of directors who measured her worth in quarterly numbers. Pressure from a company whose survival depended on decisions she alone was ultimately responsible for. He came to understand that a single wrong call, one contract lost, or one deal mishandled, could put hundreds of jobs at risk, not just her own position at the top of the company, It did not excuse the way she had treated him that first morning, but it did explain it. And understanding, for Jason, was usually the first step toward something gentler than judgment. One evening, well after the rest of the maintenance crew had gone home and the hangar had settled into the particular hush that only comes after a long working day, the two of them found themselves standing near the same jet that had nearly failed that morning, now fully repaired and cleared for flight. Selena asked him, in a tone quieter than her usual voice, why he still did this kind of work at all, given what she now understood about his background and his skill. Jason considered the question for a moment before answering that when an airplane lifted off the ground, every person on board trusted, without ever saying it out loud, that someone had checked it properly before they climbed aboard. Selena asked if he wanted to be that someone. Jason told her that he wanted to be worthy of that trust. A distinction that mattered a great deal to him, even if it sounded on the surface like the same thing. Selena studied him for a long moment in the dim hangar light, something in her expression softening into a kind of attention she rarely gave anyone, and neither of them said anything else for a while, the silence between them comfortable, in a way silence between two people who barely knew each other rarely was. It was the kind of quiet that spoke for itself, and both of them, in their own way, understood exactly what it meant, even without saying so. The moment was interrupted the following morning when Selena opened her laptop to find an email waiting in her inbox with a subject line that stopped her cold. Jason Cole is not who you think he is. The email had no signature and no clear sender name beyond a generic address, but the message inside was detailed enough to unsettle her, laying out fragments of Jason's professional history that he had never once mentioned during their days working side by side. Selena spent the morning quietly digging into what the email had hinted at, making calls to contacts in the aviation industry she trusted, and slowly, a fuller picture of Jason Cole began to take shape, one considerably more impressive than the plainly dressed contractor who had walked into her hangar with a single toolbox. He had, years earlier, worked for one of the most respected aviation maintenance and safety divisions in the country, involved in resolving some of the most technically complex incidents the industry had seen in that period. But he had left that position abruptly, and not because he had been dismissed, as the anonymous email seemed to imply with its deliberately vague phrasing. He had left because he refused to sign a safety report that he believed had been rushed and incomplete, a report that his superiors wanted finalized quickly to avoid delaying a high-profile fleet expansion. Rather than compromise, Jason had walked away from a prestigious position and a substantial salary, choosing to lose the job entirely, rather than trade away the one principle that mattered most to him. Selena sat with that information for a long time, understanding, finally, exactly the kind of man she had spent the last several days working beside, without knowing the full weight of his story. He was not a man lacking in ability, as she had first assumed from the plain jacket and the unremarkable toolbox. He simply refused to let money, prestige, or authority define who he was, a refusal that had apparently cost him a great deal over the years, and that he had never once used as a bargaining chip to renegotiate the terms she had offered him. She found him later that afternoon in the maintenance bay, and asked him directly why he had never told her any of this himself. Jason answered, without any defensiveness in his voice, that she had never asked. Selena laughed, a short, surprised sound, and admitted that she supposed that was true. She told him then, more seriously, that she had treated him very badly on the morning they met. Jason agreed simply that she had. She asked if he had been angry with her. He thought about the question honestly before answering that he had been, at first. She asked if he still was. Jason looked at her for a long moment, before saying that he was not anymore. And something in the way he said it carried more warmth than either of them had allowed themselves to show up to that point. It was a small exchange, only a handful of sentences, but it marked a turning point neither of them needed to name out loud. The quiet, unspoken shift from two people managing a professional conflict into something that had begun, almost without either of them deciding it, to feel like the early shape of trust, and maybe something more than trust. That fragile new understanding was tested almost immediately, because the company's board of directors, alarmed by the cost of the fleet-wide inspection Selena had authorized and the operational delays it had caused, summoned her to an emergency meeting demanding an explanation. Several board members argued forcefully that she was overreacting to a single incident, that the technical team already in place, led by Marcus and Victor, was more than capable of handling routine maintenance without an outside contractor, second-guessing every decision, and that continuing down this path risked damaging important client relationships who expected the fleet available on demand, not grounded for extended inspection. They pushed for Jason's involvement to be quietly ended and for operations to return to their previous, faster pace. Selena found herself standing at the center of a decision that went far beyond a single mechanic or a single company policy, a decision about whether the values she claimed to hold, safety above convenience, integrity above shortcuts, would survive real financial pressure or collapse the moment they became inconvenient. She thought about the sound Jason had heard that morning, that no instrument had detected, about the scorched component that could have failed thousands of feet in the air with people she was responsible for on board, about a man who had lost a prestigious career rather than sign his name to something he was not certain of. She stood in front of the board, took a slow breath, and told them she had already made her decision. Selena told the board, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she would not authorize any aircraft to return to service until the fleet-wide inspection Jason had recommended was completed in full, regardless of the cost or the delay it caused to any client relationship, because no contract, however valuable, was worth risking a single life over. She informed them that the company's maintenance procedures would be formally reviewed from top to bottom, with new protocols put in place to ensure that the kind of quiet shortcuts uncovered over the past several days could never again slip through unnoticed. Marcus, present in the meeting, started to object out of old habit, but stopped himself partway through the sentence, something in his expression suggesting that even he could no longer argue against what the evidence had already made undeniable. Victor, seated beside him, spoke instead. And what he said surprised nearly everyone in the room. He told the board that he had spent his entire career trusting instruments over instinct, and that this approach had nearly cost the company one of its aircraft, and possibly its chief executive, and that Jason's methods, unconventional as they seemed at first, had exposed a blind spot in the department he had led for over a decade. It was, for a man of Victor's pride and tenure, an unusually humbling admission. And Selena, watching him say it, felt a quiet respect for him that she had not expected to feel that day. The board, faced with the unified conviction of both Selena and her own technical leadership, offered no further resistance, and the inspection moved forward without further interference. Later that day, Selena stood in front of the full maintenance crew, gathered near the same hangar where the entire story had begun, and told them plainly, in front of everyone, that she had been wrong. It was not an easy sentence for a woman used to being obeyed rather than questioned, and everyone in the room understood exactly what it cost her to say it aloud. In public, without qualification or excuse, she turned to Jason afterward, standing slightly apart from the crowd, and told him that she still owed him an apology. Jason answered that she had already apologized. She shook her head and told him that was not quite true, because she had never actually apologized for the $100. She reached into her coat and handed him a folded document, a new compensation agreement reflecting what his work from that first emergency call through the entire fleet-wide inspection had actually been worth. Jason looked at the number and told her it was too much. Selena told him it was exactly what she should have offered him from the very beginning, before she had let impatience and arrogance decide how she treated someone she had not yet taken the time to understand. Jason folded the document and told her he accepted it. Selena smiled, noting that it was the first time all week he had not argued with her about anything. Jason told her that this time she had gotten it right. There was a pause between them then, comfortable rather than tense, the kind of silence two people share when they have already said everything necessary and are simply enjoying the fact that they no longer need to guard themselves against each other. Selena asked him whether he would consider staying on with the company long-term, not simply as a contractor called in for emergencies. Jason asked, carefully, in what capacity she meant. She told him not as a technician. He waited. She said, quietly, that she meant as someone she wanted beside her. In whatever form that ended up taking. someone whose judgment she trusted completely, and whose company she had come, without quite planning to genuinely enjoy. Jason held her gaze for a long moment, and neither of them rushed toward anything more than that. No dramatic gesture, no hurried declaration, just two people finally seeing each other clearly, standing quietly in a hangar that had witnessed the entire arc of how they got there. Weeks later, the same jet that had nearly failed on that first chaotic morning was wheeled out onto the tarmac again, fully inspected, fully repaired, cleared without a single flag on any report. The engines started, and this time the sound that rose from them was clean, and even from the very first second, no hidden tremor, no warning lights waiting to surprise anyone. Selena stood beside Jason at the edge of the runway, watching the aircraft prepare for departure, and asked him, almost teasingly, what he heard. Jason listened for a moment before answering that he heard a healthy airplane. Selena asked, then, what he heard when he listened to her. Jason turned to look at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression that had not been there on the morning they first met. He told her that she was learning how to listen. Selena laughed, a real laugh this time, easy and unguarded, in a way that felt entirely new for her, and the two of them stood together as the jet rolled forward and lifted smoothly into a clear morning sky. Jason had once been valued, in the coldest possible sense, at exactly $100, a number meant to dismiss him, to put him in his place, to remind him of exactly how replaceable he was supposed to be in a world run by people who measured worth only in figures on a page. But by the end, Selena understood something she had never fully grasped before that morning changed everything for her. A person's true value was never measured by what someone else was willing to pay for them. It was measured by what they were willing to do, quietly and without recognition, in the moments when no one else was watching at all.